Good afternoon. Welcome to Islander EI. The talk you are about to see, or listen to, sorry, is the cyber shell game, War, Information Warfare, and the Darkening Web, with Alexander Klimburg. A couple things to get out of the way before we start here is just stop by the Black Hat Arsenal on level 2, located in Mandela Bay, Oceanside, and Shoreline ballrooms during the day. There is a welcome reception at 5:30 this evening, and join us for the Pony Awards in Lagoon J, K, and L at 6:30. And thank you everyone for joining us, and here's Alexander.
So hello everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for still being interested in this topic after Jeff Moss and Bruce Schneier and Mikko Hyppönen talked about it. You might be fed up with hearing about this type of thing. Apparently you're not. That's good, because we're going to go through all of that again, more detail, and a lot more slides. So I'm a somewhat typical professional think tanker. For the last 10 years or so, I've been hanging out in cyber diplomacy forums, such as within the United Nations, in Geneva and New York, and the OSCE in Vienna. And we talk about the issues of war and peace in cyberspace. And I come from this, therefore, from a national security background, and a little bit of information assurance and a little bit of risk management. But I'm pretty much old school cyber, and I'm not really an expert in disinformation or artificial intelligence, all that new stuff, which a lot of people can talk about a lot better than I do. I talk about war and peace in cyberspace from the view of diplomats and national cybersecurity experts, and I'm trying to communicate what I have learned looking at this domain for the last 10 years as a policy person, the last 30 years as a technologist, and tell you what I think. Because I think you and I, we all probably share a basic ideology. We really do care about the free internet. We really care about the internet as is right now. Now, unlike me, you probably don't really think about it that much because you have a real job to do. But this is my job, and I like to worry. And I worry quite a lot about what happens in cyberspace, about the things that are done in cyberspace, but also the things that are done to cyberspace. And the one takeaway I want to leave with you, just from the start, is that my conclusion is not to worry so much about the militarization of cyberspace, but rather worry about the weaponization of information. Because it's not so much the attacks in cyberspace that could really have a detrimental effect on our future, but it's actually attacks on cyberspace that could change it, and change the free internet that we know today, and that would be a seriously bad thing. So, first of all, an ambiguity disclaimer. We don't even agree on how to spell the word cybersecurity, so it shouldn't be much of a surprise that we can't really agree on what it means. You can write it as two different words, you can write it as one word, you can put a hyphen in between if you're not sure. It's pretty much completely anarchic. I've actually seen one government use two different spellings in the same document. And the reason for that is, of course, there is no such thing as one cyber. There's a military intelligence view of cyber, and that would be, of course, completely different from the law enforcement and critical infrastructure protection view. So there's a lot of different views about what cyberspace and cybersecurity is, but there are countries, for instance, who will say there is no such thing as cyberspace and cybersecurity. They actually insist on talking about the information domain. And that's the term they want to use because they're convinced that cyberspace is actually a nefarious idea that was put out there to effectively influence their policy. So they don't talk about cyberspace, they talk about the information domain. But we talk about cyberspace. And we know that it used to be a fictional construct. It didn't really exist. It was technically meaningless. But it exists now. It exists in a technical sense, it exists in a policy sense, in a legal sense, and it's more than an internet. It includes all activities that are conducted through this virtual domain, including human interactions. Now, this pyramid is a pretty good reminder of also what we're looking at it when we look at cyberspace from a targeter perspective. And this is actually something all of you really know, but I'm trying to remind you of how important it is. We all know that cyberspace has a physical domain. We all know it has a logical domain, the codes and the protocols. We all know it has a data domain. But as an attack person, somebody who does offense, you're going to be 9 times out of 10 most interested in the social domain. You're going to want to effect change there. Everything else is going to be a detour. You'll take a detour through the data domain. You'll take a detour through the logical domain. You really just want to hit the social domain 9 times out of 10. 9 times out of 10. And you're going to probably be looking at this and thinking, what does this have to do with what I do? Well, I want to think back to what Jeff Moss said last year when he said he was worrying because while we have tactics, he said, the adversary has strategy. And you probably, as technical experts, are all experts in tactics. So what I'm saying, take this domain, take this image, and apply it, though, not necessarily to your products, but apply it to cyberspace. Imagine how, for instance, attacks on the social domain could, for instance, influence, in effect, the physical reality of cyberspace. Because as a lot of people have said today, Mikko Hyppönen and Jeff Moss among them, this is an artificial domain. This is the only artificial domain out there. We created cyberspace. We say what gravity is in cyberspace. If we want gravity to change in cyberspace, it will change. And I believe if our perception of cyberspace changes, it will change, and not necessarily for the better. So I would like to take you on a bit of a journey, because I think all of you are actually, as technical experts, the people who should be having a strategic view so you understand really what the strategic game in cyberspace can also be. So we're going to play a shell game of international cybersecurity, and it has basically 6 parts to it. The first bit is you pick your basic conflict paradigm, your perhaps subconscious model of what you think the whole thing is like. The second, you're going to pick what you mean by cyber attack and what you think that means on the level of, for instance, national response. Third, we're going to have a brief look at some of the cyber tactics, techniques, and procedures and orders of battles of the major cyber powers and what that basically means about how they feel about cyber conflict. Fourthly, we'll look at information warfare as an operational approach and how it's applied. And fifth, we're going to pick up some of the worst outcomes you can possibly have from a diplomatic point of view. Your cyber-geddon, if you will. What's the thing you think we should prepare for, and how should we plan our diplomatic approach appropriately? And finally, we're going to pick some options on how we should all respond as a group. So like Jeff said today, it's a good idea to start with your basic model of how you view this domain. So what are your offensive effects in cyberspace? So let's start with, do you think it's for like kinetic equivalence? Do you think cyber effects are always about supporting a military operation or blowing up critical infrastructure? Is it about the data, always the data in whatever form, for intelligence gathering purposes, for intellectual property theft, for indications and warning? Or is it about directly moving a narrative, changing someone's thinking and correspondingly getting them to do something they might have not otherwise have done? Likewise, you should pick your battlefield. Is it the internet per se, with the networks and the nodes and the data going between it? Is it the endpoints, the deep data of cyberspace, and all the potentially accessible information? Or is it the rules and policies, the very technical standards of the domain itself? Basically the stuff that makes all the other stuff work. What do you think is the real battlefield here? And that's a conversation that pretty much has consumed a couple of tens of millions of dollars of consultancy fees between the DoD and everyone else. This is for free. You also want to ask yourself, what is your information security? Most of us will have been educated in a very straightforward view of what information security means. It's all about protecting the data. It's all about the confidentiality, the integrity, the availability of the data. All of this somehow interacts with other concepts such as cybersecurity, maybe internet security, network security, and then interacts with such policy terms such as counter cybercrime or cyber safety. But InfoSec, you might think, is a pretty uncontentious term. Or if you were educated in Russia or a bunch of other places, you might see information security this way. And it's described in the Russian draft proposal for one of the most important international treaty proposals that have been out there in the UN for the last 10, 15 years. And the way to describe information security is pretty much the way you would think some countries describe national cybersecurity. So maybe that's not so much of a difference. You say information security, I say cybersecurity, not much of a difference. But if you look on the right-hand side, you're going to see a quote from the Russian Information Security Doctrine of the year 2016. And if you look at this a little bit closely, you're going to see that the cyber attacks that they refer to are actually information attacks. So what does this magical information attack actually mean? What does this constitute? Is it only technical, or is it also psychological? And if you think it's also psychological, yes, you're right. And guess what? In an earlier version of this document, Information Security Doctrine of 2000, the purpose of information security was even defined more simply, namely to protect the spiritual renewal of Russia. from outside hostile attacks like criticism, etc. The information security doctrine is not only a key document understanding about how Russia, for instance, views cyberspace, it's also critical for us to understand how information attacks are perceived. Because fundamentally it comes down to the question, what is your historical analogy? What do you think cyberspace is most like when you talk about cyber conflict? Do you think it was like the advent of the aeroplane, for instance, in the First World War, that added a reconnaissance artillery spotting option to basic army function? Or do you think it was like the advent of gunpowder that added the dimension of fire to maneuver and shock? Or do you think it's like the advent of the wheel that basically was a historical change of such scope that civilizations probably only have that type of thing every couple of thousand of years? And everything changed with the advent of the wheel. So if you think cyberspace is the biggest thing ever, then you're probably going to take the last option. Most Western governments take the first option, and that influences pretty much how they design their policies and how they prepare for this conflict. The related question to this is simply, what do you think, again, in national security terms, is a cyber attack? So if you have a Western government-induced background, you probably at one point ingested Joint Staff Publication 313. This is the basic Department of Defense document that outlined what information operations is. And it was crafted way back in 2000. It describes what computer network operations are, CNO. And CNO has the subdivisions of computer network attack, computer network exploitation, computer network defense. It all looks very simple and technically fine, and we can move on from there. But we have forgotten where it actually was embedded. It was embedded in a much wider doctrine that included psychological operations, military deception, and even stuff like public affairs and public diplomacy. It was a part of a psychological warfare paradigm. It was just toned down a lot. And when things moved to the newest version of this document, which is JP 312, we went a bit further. We defined cyber operations as also having, for instance, two different parts of cyber intelligence gathering. For instance, cyberspace OPE, which is operational preparation of the environment, that's effectively preparing the battlefield, or cyberspace ISR, intelligence, surveillance, reconnaissance. So CNE, computer network exploitation, the technical term for cyber espionage, was further elaborated upon, and you would think, oh, it's become more technical, not more psychological. But cyberspace OPE, which is intended, in my view, to mean something quite technical in this case, preparation of the environment, could mean something else if you approach it from a psychological point of view. So I ask you, what would operational preparation of the cyberspace environment look like if you wanted to change the domain to fit your needs as an attacker? Now, if you're educated, for instance, in Russia or China or many other places, you're going to actually see the entire thing a little bit differently. You're going to see it only in psychological terms. The document on the left is a translation of input-output decision tree associated with one of their main doctrines, reflexive control. Reflexive control effectively breaks down everything to information packets, which is technologically independent, and it's all about one thing only, to get your adversary to do something they wouldn't otherwise do. It's basically a psychological warfare tool, it's a manipulation tool, and it works irrespective of the conflict. In a military conflict, it also works in peacetime. And it fundamentally is supported by cyber. And this is why I think the principle that we should understand is that many of the cyber operations that we see, that we're exposed to, are actually just part of a wider paradigm, which is an information warfare paradigm in all but name. And this is the paradigm that many of our adversaries actually are working from. They don't really care that much about the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of your data. They really are trying to change a narrative. And we're going to be talking a lot about what that narrative is. However, in the real world, so to speak, we still have to worry about thresholds for war, for instance. What is a cyber attack according to, for instance, the UN Charter? Well, this is a question that we've been discussing quite at some depth for many years now. The US government has made a pronouncement on it. NATO has basically indicated that Article 5 would come into force under certain conditions. And those conditions are effectively summarized with the international law definition you see here, which is basically that cyber is equivalent, that anything that arises to the level of an equivalent of an armed attack with significant casualties and economic loss or weakening of national security. Further though, and this is an interpretation of the Talon Manual, it does not include nonviolent operations such as psychological cyber operations or cyber espionage. Now that is a major problem for a nice big part of the world, because even though international law probably has a pretty clear opinion of it, Other countries, Russia and China, traditionally have also spoken of the importance of psychological operations or even media warfare as constituting a casus belli. So this might not correspond with international law, but international law, you might be surprised to hear, isn't always adhered to. And this is, in point of fact, a paradigm that the West created, but not everyone agrees to. Fundamentally, what is your basic concept of warfare? Do you believe what Clausewitz said, namely that warfare was a continuation of policy? Or do you believe what Vladimir Ilyich Lenin is often implied as having said, which is that basically politics is a continuation of warfare? The one implies that war is a temporary and exceptional situation. The other implies that war is continuous, non-stop, and that it's fought not only with kinetic means, but also non-kinetic means. The first version is pretty much the foundation of international law. The second is pretty much the foundation of reality for a large section of the cyberspace community. When we look at how some governments effectively approach the subject, we get a bit more of an idea of where they think information operations, which in this context we'll describe as being kinetic, and information warfare falls. But we also see that sometimes they blend rather closely together. So let's start first with the United States. A very, very brief overview in 4 minutes of what I think the US cyber power is. The US has continuously invested in the policy of effectively hard deterrence. Now, this is probably due to a number of reasons. Most importantly, I think, is simply the size of the country, and the large attack surface makes doing national cybersecurity defensively very difficult. Of course, there are additional challenges with the US Constitution and similar, but simply the attack surface is very, very hard to defend. This deterrence is usually expressed in kinetic equivalent terms. However, cyber originally started very much in a psychological warfare context. Back in the 1990s, we talked about net ops, we talked about info war, we even talked about net war at one point. And actually, back then, those operations were psychological. For instance, in 1994, the US government did a pretty effective information warfare operation against the security forces of Haiti to make them lay down their arms to not oppose a US invasion. Probably a pretty successful outcome given the fact that otherwise it would have come to significant bloodshed. In 2000 in Serbia, the US government initiated a large-scale information warfare attack against the Serbian political and military leadership, which according to some published sources amounted to their phones ringing incessantly at all times of night, even if they took it off there. So I don't know how effective that was, but it's a good story in any case. In 2000, JP 313, the document we referred to beforehand, was codified, and a decision was, however, made. The US was not going to go down the full information warfare route. Why? It was because getting involved in large-scale propaganda and mass covert influencing wasn't American warfighting way, unquote, of a member of that group. Effectively, it was decided that the US was not going to commit itself to a policy of continuous psychological warfare on a level, for instance, that Russia and China have always had as part of their doctrines, which of course includes the media as an essential part of the battlefield. The global war on terror and the massive expansion of cyber intelligence gathering, SIGINT at motion, SIGINT at rest, etc., of course, did put a slight different change on that, and certain authorities, such as the Cowie Authority, the countering adversary use of the internet, actually touched again on information warfare topics. In top of this, you had certain very large intelligence gathering programs, or programs that were for expanding the cybersecurity capacities of the United States, the Comprehensive National Cyber Initiative, and the stand-up of US Cybercom, all occurred around the same time, providing again an additional focus more on the DoD way of doing war, doing cyber warfare rather than more a psychological warfare-oriented approach that the intelligence community had originally followed. After 2011, work started on a new information operations doctrine, where people paid more attention to offensive cyber effects operations. This is the JP 312 that we talked about beforehand. And at the same time, a document was actually codified to help battlefield cyber be more understandable. That's in FM 338. Battlefield cyber is the stuff that you would use to, for instance, knock out an air defense system to allow your bomber to fly in. And that is not known as offensive cyber effects operations as much as cyber electromagnetic activities. Blends in with electronic warfare rather seamlessly. Now, despite these documents being kind of public, there is not a lot of public information at the time of how the US would actually, though, do cyber deterrence. And there was a lot of political pressure growing, in particular from the US Congress, that the executive had to take a much stronger stand and explain to the adversary exactly what the US position was vis-a-vis certain cyber activities. In 2013, they got some help. The APT1 report was published by Mandiant, probably one of the most significant occurrences in my view in international cybersecurity, effectively doxing, revealing in depth the capabilities of a Chinese cyber espionage unit. That followed rather quickly in 2014 with the indictment of 5 PLA officials for engaging in intellectual property theft. This was the first time that law was used in this kind of context, and it was actually the first time that a certain hallowed precept that we had been hearing for 15 years was actually followed through on. And that precept was, if we're attacked in cyberspace, we will respond, but not necessarily only with cyber means. We will respond with diplomatic, with military, with economic means, plus informational. But nobody ever did anything seemingly, and this was the very first time that something of this order publicly was done, and it was highly effective. Within 1 year, there was the C. Obama agreement, or ceasefire, and intellectual property theft said to be emanating from China dropped drastically as a result. Now, it came back in part recently, but that has to do more with the present political situation. The fact that it dropped to begin with just showed you how effective this indictment policy was. And it was a policy then that was extended. Similar indictments were issued against, for instance, Russian and Iranian hackers. However, at the same time, in 2015, a policy started to develop of looking what would be the in-band response available to the executive, to cyber policy members. How could you effectively threaten a retaliatory response with cyber means? And this is the beginning of the persistent engagement debate that we've been seeing the last couple of years in the United States. It's not really much a debate. It's actually now effectively stated policy. And it's also tied more with the stand-up of more public offensive cyber capabilities that are part and parcel of the US Cyber Mission Force, about 6,800 people working directly for that in US Cyber Command, which was attained full operational capability only about a year ago. Now, the problem for me with persistent engagement is that it does one thing. It gives public credence to the Russian point of view that there was little difference between peacetime and wartime operations. And I think this is a critical error. I think there's a lot of other things that are in the document that are smart and that are good. But I think to publicly state that we don't really think there's a difference between peacetime and wartime anymore is pretty dangerous, because it also provides implicit support to the general approach, the general Leninistic approach of information warfare is actually true. And that actually the thing that we really need to worry about is not cyber weapons, but information weapons. And this is actually something that, well, a number of countries, including China, pretty much have always thought anyway. So in China, cyberspace development started really, really early. In the 1990s, 3 different schools all ended up playing a specific important role in development of doctrine in cyberspace. You had the People's War in Cyberspace guys, you had the guys who developed integrated network-enabled warfare, and you had those guys who developed the 3 warfare concepts. Now, today, the first large-scale cyber operation started already in 2002, and they were started by a group that still exists today. And that just kind of underlines not only how old cyber is in China, but also how massive. It's very difficult to say how many people are actually engaged in cyber operations. It depends on who you ask. But 3 PLA, which is basically the equivalent of the US NSA, and used to be directly responsible for most of the technical reconnaissance battalions that are brigades that were responsible for this type of activity. It's now shifted responsibility slightly. Had anywhere between 20,000 to 50,000 people employed on the subject. You can compare that to the 6,700 odd people that the Cyber Mission Force in the US has. And they are today roughly clustered, however, overall in 40 to 80 different intrusion sets, only half of which are necessarily military, and not all of which are even easily attributable to the government. So there's a lot of cyber activity going on here. And in the year 2000, 2010, a lot of that was down to the Patriot hacker community, which were enabled through this concept of people's war in cyberspace. They also, of course, got heavily into intellectual property theft for a number of different reasons that we don't have time to get in today. But the fact that this was a part of policy became apparent with the very, very rapid decrease in intellectual property theft that occurred after the C-Obama agreement in 2015. Now, that kind of also had something to do with the purge happening in the PLA at the same time, while C kind of like cleaned up a little bit. And also the fact that at that time, Cyber Command in China was effectively stood up. That's a strategic support force, that's, as is known as the SSF. So a lot of different reasons could have been put out there why intellectual property theft decreased, but effectively it decreased a lot, and cyber operations in China seemed to change as a result afterwards. And so some of my colleagues have also made the observation that Chinese cyber is increasingly becoming more Russian. What they tend to mean, at least publicly, is that it seems to follow an MO that sometimes people associate with American cyber operations, which is more about this pre-positioning. It's about being prepared for the big boom, and it's all preparing for war fighting. But there's also a second part, and that is that it is increasingly investing in information warfare. The three warfare strategy that was outlined first back in the early days of the internet, early days of cyber conflict, remains one of the only published information warfare concepts in the world. It includes psychological warfare, media warfare, and legal warfare, also known as lawfare, as part of its arsenal. And it's always active, not only in wartime, it's also active in peacetime. And while it kind of like coasted for about a decade or so without being particularly acted on, it became a lot more relevant in recent years. And even actually the information warfare unit that is tasked with doing the three warfare strategy was recently attached to the strategic support force, indicating that it became operationalized. How does this look in practice? Well, it looks like in practice, for instance, we had in 2015, we had an interesting occurrence when there was a public unrest situation in Hong Kong, and something was unleashed that we call the Great Cannon, or sometimes also the Great Fire Hose. And that, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is basically a tool that used parts of the Great Firewall infrastructure to effectively create an instant botnet, which was then used to DDoS websites that people may have thought were supporting the activist and dissident activities in Hong Kong. And this was therefore a direct use of a kind of unknown cyber tool to effectively exercise an information warfare operation, because this operation itself didn't do much damage, but it was a very clear indication to anyone who was watching, don't mess with our internal sovereignty. And sovereignty, protecting the sovereignty of cyberspace, the sovereignty of China, is by far the most important goal, not only of the PLA, which belongs to the CCP, but also of the government altogether. And they have changed their view of the role, what role cyberspace plays in this. They used to think it was basically a tolerated evil that they had to put up with if they wanted to have foreign direct investment. In the last 5 years or so, this has greatly changed. The Great Firewall works much better, and they've also figured out it can be used, cyberspace overall, as a great tool of social control. So the Great Firewall itself now has over 60,000 sensors working for it on behalf of the government, but also has somewhere approaching 2 million part-time sensors or political activists that work from the comfort of their own home and basically are active in the Chinese cyberspace. These are the so-called 50-cent army. And this 50-cent army of 2 million is pretty much larger than the entire PLA. And it gives you a bit of an indication also of what role security of the cyber domain has for the Chinese leadership. Controlling the information consumed by their citizens is by far the most important goal. And indeed, they are creating now a cyberspace, their own cyberspace, which is larger by far than the US or European cyberspace, maybe even partially put together. And that is also being a model of other authoritarian regimes on what cyberspace can do for their government. How can it contribute to that all-important goal of social stability? Now, Russia has had a very long experience in thinking about cyberspace. Actually, they've been thinking about it a lot longer than the United States has. It's Norbert Wiener, the guy who invented effectively the term of cyberkinetics as the means to control man and machine, basically was considered to be the only person to single-handedly conquer Russia, according to a colleague at MIT. The Russians were obsessed by him. They read him everywhere, they quoted him everywhere. He pops up, his name pops up in the most important high-level political conferences in the end of the 50s and the beginning of the 60s. The Soviet Union really thought the cyberkinetic revolution is the AI of today. If we get it, whoever gets there first will dominate the world. And they said this quite often. And then they went off and they even tried to create their own internet. It was called OGAS. And for 15 years, they beavered away on this. But it was a top-down internet, and like all other top-down internets, it didn't really work. Still, other parts of cyberkinetics and information management had a great appeal to the Soviet government. In particular, that of active measures. Now, active measures is sometimes referred to by people as, oh, it's that type of thing, it's active measures, it's just propaganda. Active measures goes beyond just propaganda. It can include assassination, blackmail, all the really dirty stuff that you would hope intelligence agencies only engage in very, very, very rarely. Active measures lifts the whole thing up to an operational paradigm that not many governments actually have. This idea of active measures, which has existed since the 1950s and actually even beforehand, was greatly supported by the advent of cyberspace. And as we'll see in a moment, in the 1990s and 2000, it really came to fruition. At the same time, the military developed in the 1970s the concept that I referred to beforehand, reflexive control. Reflexive control, again, is effectively psychological warfare at a strategic level. In most Western militaries, psychological warfare maybe will go to brigade level. You might have a corps level response, but it doesn't really go all the way. In this model, it's the entire game. Psychological warfare is the most important dimension. Reflexive control reflected that, and for nearly 2 decades before the collapse of the Soviet Union, it represented one of the most important doctrines they had. This is integrated very well, these two streams of thought, with the rise of the Russian intelligence community, in particular after 2000, which also corresponded very well with the beginning of large-scale cyber operations, in particular against the West. The Russian intelligence obviously has, like the Chinese, an overriding interest in protecting its own cyberspace from hostile influence, and they have a number of different tools to do that. SORM 2, which was introduced in the late 90s, early 2000s, effectively captured all telephone conversations, and SORM 3, which was rolled out in 2014, basically captures all data per se. And this type of effectively being able to do deep packet inspection across your entire country at scale does give Russia a certain amount of transparency of what happens with their own cyber domain, including the activities of Russian cyber criminals, which, as many of you have known, have risen to effectively the level of a tool of statecraft. The importance of protecting Russia information domain was outlined, as I said beforehand, in the Information Security Doctrine of 2000, and replaced also with a similar document in 2016. Now, while Russia shares a Chinese obsession with how to do this, it also had its own hacker patriots, as they call them. Patriot hackers is the Chinese version. They call it hacker patriots. It had a different way of dealing with them. They were involved in the 2007 and 2008 attacks, for instance, on Estonia and Georgia. But they also have been scaled down slightly, and we've seen a shift away from the use of these actors as cyber actors, moving more into a direct information warfare context. So Russian capabilities have previously seemed to have a kind of a war pre-positioning feel to it, kind of the stuff you would expect basically militaries to be doing to effectively create leverage for conflict. But sometimes it didn't quite map out. For instance, when you had maybe malware like dark energy deployed in a US power grid, and it's so easy to find. Now, why would that be the case? Why would you, for instance, have implants that draw attention to themselves at the weirdest of times? A lot of the cyber activities that you would normally associate with pre-positioning and preparing the battlefield were actually quite open, transparent. And that effectively creates this notion that, in fact, it wasn't so much the kinetic effect that Russia was trying to influence. It was a different effect. It was a media effect. It was a narrative effect. And this effectively is part of the calculation that both Russia and China have, that cyberspace is for them, and has been for over a decade, the most essential domain. If you look back until cybersecurity documents in the West, in Europe for instance, they will say national cybersecurity, oh, it's maybe a top 5 concern, maybe it's a top 3 of concern. In Russia and China, it's been #1 concern for quite a while. Because again, it's all about consuming the information that is produced or transmitted to your population. And that comes down to, what do you think information warfare is? Underpinning this, there are different models. We've talked about the US emphasis in kinetic cyber information operations and Chinese-Russian interest in information warfare. So let's look at what we think information warfare means in practice. Now, some of you might have heard of the term, which is the wrong expression for it, of the Gerasimov doctrine. So General Gerasimov is a chief of the Russian General Staff in 2013. He made a speech that was highly reported, it was translated and highly reported, basically on hybrid warfare and non-linear warfare in general. And in the media, it's been sometimes referred to as being the war plan of how Russia will operate in the future, and that how it uses active measures, for instance, in advance of kinetic operations. So for instance, it was often said that this was the roadmap for the pretty non-violent takeover of the Crimea in 2014, which is a pretty amazing military operation. The thing is that's not completely accurate. It was a speech that, for instance, had active measures as directly part of military measures. And most Russian specialists will tell you active measures is very often referred to as being an alternative to military kinetic measures. In point of fact, Russian doctrine since quite a long time, not only 2010, but even before 2010, has referred to other measures being more important than military measures. The rise of non-military means of achieving political and strategic goals has grown. In many cases, they've exceeded the power of forces of the weapons and their effectiveness. This is a military doctrine basically saying military doesn't matter anymore. So it's all been supplemented by military means of concealed character, including carrying out actions of informational conflict. So this was the stated doctrine. This was much more explicit than the Gerasimov doctrine, if such a thing exists. And it basically clearly indicates that this idea of nonlinear warfare and also of continuous warfare has been out there for a while. And what it does refer to, just to come back to that for a second, is most important of the Gerasimov statement was this statement here of the rationale for why this was all important. And the rationale it gave was, as we saw in North Africa, we saw the use of technologies for influencing state structures and population with the help of information networks. What it basically says was, the Arab Spring was a CIA plot. All of it was one part of a large information warfare operation, a large active measure operation that had these great consequences, and we, Russia, are responding to these types of operations. So this is where we need to come back. Where does that leave us? So what's your information warfare narrative? So there's two different storylines you can pick up here. On the right, you see a neat graph by Mark Galotti. He's a noted Russian strategist, expert in the European Council of Foreign Relations. And he put together a nice little graph that indicates for him not only which countries are being targeted in Europe as part of this prolonged information warfare campaign, but also what the intended effects are. But why is this occurring? As I said beforehand, the Russian narrative is they are responding to Western attacks. On the West, and they all started, again, in Serbia in the year 2000, when, according to this narrative, civil society groups supported anti-Milosevic forces and toppled the government. These same forces, which included US NGOs, basically democracy activists, then went on to support similar movements in the Ukraine, in Kazakhstan, everywhere, and effectively helped underpin what is now known as the color revolutions, which were, from a point of view of the Kremlin, pretty frightening occurrences. Now, they go off and they say, and I don't mean they, I mean not only the Russians, but also the Chinese and also some others, that this was a direct active measure operations of the West. And when I have conversations with senior policymakers in these countries, I say, but they're activists, and we talk about the NGOs that were, for instance, deployed in Serbia. We even talk about the individuals that were there. And I says, but they're civil society activists. It says, like, they're doing it because they believe in it. They're like Christian missionaries. You know, you can't really tell them what to do. They go off and maybe they get state support, state financing, but they're not necessarily under the control of the intelligence community, at least I think. And they respond, the civil society doesn't exist. For them, in their model, if you studied political science, it would be a neo-Gramscian model of the world. There's only two things. There's the companies, the private sector, and the government, and the civil society is the battlefield. So any kind of civil society action, effectively, by its very nature, is a proxy action. And therefore, their response, irrespective of how much the government has these little actors under control, is directed against states. How does this occur? So this is one analyst's view of techniques, and one analyst's view of one of those reactions, namely the 2016 hack of the US presidential election. Now, a really great deal has been said about how this election was interfered with, and this would easily be a presentation of its own. But I like this slide because it mostly tacks with what I think the actual modes were of interference, both with attribution, with a white and overt types of activities that were part of a narrative that was put out by both state media organizations, but also overt statements, a semi-covert or gray area, and a very black and covert area. But for me, the most interesting part of it is not necessarily that this was highly effective, and that it also made pretty much Western policymakers take information warfare seriously, at least those outside, places in Europe which have been exposed to it for 15 years. But also, it also basically illustrated to us, cyber people, that hey, us cyber stuff does matter in this context as well. Because if you look at a lot of the activities that occurred here, a lot of it was cyber enabled. Some of these operations could have been mistaken for other types of information operations. We could be sitting there and going, maybe they were interested in the confidentiality of that data, or maybe they wanted to change the integrity of it. No, they didn't really. They just wanted to dox it. They wanted to put it out. They wanted to have a narrative effect. So this is what I am most interested in when I see this type of activity. There are a lot of people who can speak a lot more in detail about how disinfo works. We can do that a little bit maybe later on. But most important for me was this was considered a response by many of the non-American observers to what Russia and China have often described as hostile US-led covert actions against their regime. Now, this is not the only way to do it, though. There are also more explicit cases of information warfare masquerading as information operations. So my favorite example is the April 2015 attack on the French TV network TV5. TV5 is one of the largest networks in France, and when it went down hard. All 12 channels went off air completely. And it's easily probably one of the most significant cyber attacks I think have been historically reported on. Within a day, we also knew who had done it. An online jihadi group called the Cyber Caliphate, pronounced Je suis ISIS. Fantastic, right? So suddenly we had a real cyber terrorist incident. And this was a big thing because we actually never talk about cyber terrorism in the West. It's actually a term that since 1998 has popped up in a lot of documents by authoritarian nations, but the like-minded group of liberal democracies, they talk about terrorist use of the internet when they talk about terrorist activities online, not cyber terrorism. Why is that? Because cyber terrorism has very often been laid out to be primarily an issue of controlling content. Cyber terrorism was very often an issue of take down that website of religious extremism or that translation of the New York Times. It wasn't so much about kinetic boom, but about psychological boom. And therefore, we didn't really get into the entire discussion. Every single time Russians or Chinese or others would talk about cyber terrorism, we would go, terrorist use of the internet. But suddenly the media was talking about cyber terrorism. And this was at a really crucial period in Europe. This was the very first time that a cyber legislation was being developed in Europe. The Network Information Security Directive, the NIS directive, was being finalized just in that period. And suddenly cyber terrorism was everywhere. There was huge political pressure to include it in the final draft of a document that was going to be probably one of the most far-reaching pieces of legislation in the world on cyber in the second largest economy in the world. And suddenly it had to include a term that for 20 years had been basically the battle line between those who wanted to keep issues of information control out of discussions about international security. And suddenly we had this problem. And then what happened was somebody in the French government, presumably the French government, leaked that it wasn't really cyber caliphate. It was actually, from their point of view, APT-28, Russian military intelligence group. So why the hell were they engaged in this act of false flagging? See Network Information Security Directive. There was pretty much no other explanation. There were a lot of other explanations that we tried to go through, from counterterrorism operations to similar. They don't map up. It does map up, however, perfectly with the timeline that we had for rolling out the Network Information Security Directive. And to be honest with you, there's a lot of other examples just like this, but they're not as easy to prove with open sources. And that's the point. So information warfare very often masquerades as information operations. And some of the biggest cyber attacks we've seen probably actually had really a narrative effect intended rather than a more clearly defined tactical outcome. And this is where we have to ask, if you're a cyber diplomat, what's your cyber get-on? What are you most worried about? So if you're in the great cyber game, as I call it, and you have to sit down international cybersecurity, you need to start with what are we going to work together to prevent as a world community? What's the common nightmare that we can help to address? It used to be pretty clear. For 50 years, the great mushroom cloud was the one thing we were all trying to avoid, at least it happening by accident. So then we would worry about inadvertent escalation and loss of escalation control. Today, we use exactly the same words. Inadvertent escalation, i.e. accidental war, and loss of escalation control, i.e. nobody being able to talk to each other because we've blown up all the communication networks. So back then, for 50 years, despite being basically an ideological death match, everybody had a common outcome. That was prevent this. So, we could make some progress, but it did take us about 3 or 4 decades to get there. Today, it's a little bit more complicated because we don't have one nightmare, we have 2 nightmares. Your one nightmare might well be, for instance, your one nightmare might be, for instance, that of cyber warfare destroying all critical infrastructure. The other nightmare might be that, however, of information warfare, toppling your regime. I'm actually running out of time, so I'm going to skip through some slides. Basically, this is what we've been talking about. We're talking about political, military, cyber. We're talking about UN, and we're talking about stuff that pretty much does not touch on the most critical aspect altogether, which is internet governance. The internet governance is the management of, effectively, the world's internet resources. It's basically where all the standards and protocols are made, and it's basically also where we decide what cyberspace looks like. And this is really the most interesting thing to a lot of those countries, but we don't talk about it in the UN because we're worried about what they might want to do with it. They want to change, effectively, the way it's run. And it's run today by the multi-stakeholder model. The multi-stakeholder model is basically you. It's the government, the private sector, it's the civil society, all working together to effectively set standards and policy for the worldwide internet. This is really a problem for a lot of people because effectively security is a tiny part of this constellation. It's a very, very small part of what internet governance is made of, and that's a real problem for some countries because, again, for them the most important thing is to influence the way cyberspace is constructed and construed. I'm going to skip over a bunch of these slides. One of the most important things we've had, for instance, was a showdown in 2012 between those nations that want to change internet governance, effectively led by Russia and China, and those countries led by the United States that wanted to keep it as a multi-stakeholder domain. And in Dubai in 2012, we had first time in world history, we had a showdown where effectively 85 nations voted for changes to a structure of the ITU, and the like-minded group of democracies, the free internet group of democracies, effectively were in the minority. There were 55 nations that voted against the ITRs. So basically the US and our allies were outnumbered in an international consortium, a very important meeting that basically tried to expand the narrative of internet governance from a multi-stakeholder environment to an intergovernmental environment. Why do all this? Well, because for some countries, they have an inexplicable fascination with the root. They think the root of the internet effectively is the DNS root. They think the DNS route effectively will allow them, which is most of you will know, is a single file that effectively is updated twice a day, and which is rolled out to the other root zone operators, and which is at Anycast, about 500 other servers, and effectively it amounts to the telephone book of the internet. And they have said for years that this thing cannot be managed by ICANN. It cannot be managed by a civil society organization in California. It needs to be controlled by government. And they give political reasons for this. But there are also other reasons. And the reason is that one of the best ways to control, for instance, information is, besides blocking and filtering, is notice and take down. If you have a problem with content in another country, you can actually call them up and you can ask, please make sure that this content doesn't reach my cyberspace. And if you have good relationships with that government, they'll do that. That's how Germany and France, for instance, work with the United States very often. For Russia and for China, this is the best way to make sure that effectively bad content does not reach their cyberspace, just in case the Great Firewall springs a leak, for instance, and you need to patch it. So controlling the root, in their minds, although it doesn't really work that way, as many technical people can say, is not only a political goal, it for them is the one goal to make sure that cyberspace overall becomes a question of state sovereignty, something that they can use to control their own environment and guarantee the well-being of their own citizens. It comes down to what you think cyberspace should be. Effectively, we don't have time for this anymore. Look up what the social credit score system in China amounts to. It is probably one of the most amazing pieces of artifice since the internet has been created. It makes George Orwell blush, and it pretty much is a model of what the internet could look like if we effectively don't tackle this the way that I'm proposing we tackle, which is effectively make sure that it does not become a domain only of governments, but remains a domain of the multi-stakeholder society. Right, there are a lot of different ways to address this. I got about like 40 seconds left on my clock here. So basically, we have a lot of different ways of how we're going to address this issue. I can tell you a lot of them are not going to work. Resilience isn't going to work. Deterrence isn't going to work. Regulation, that's not going to work either. The only thing that's really going to work here is investing in the multi-stakeholder model. That's you. That's for you to have a real active interest in what this domain means. This means that you engage yourself in security legislation and policy, that you don't basically just leave that to government and say they'll sort it out, that you as a technical expert get involved and basically say, I don't know what this is going to do to the cyberspace that I have grown up with. You also can participate in internet governance. You can become more involved in effectively the creation of these standards and norms that basically govern cyberspace. You will have people in your teams that really have something to offer, and you should let them go and participate not only in a salesmanship role, but simply in the community role. And finally, support your civil society efforts, even though there are sometimes these rather annoying activists and other types of people involved. Multi-stakeholder model needs 3 legs to stand on, and effectively the internet was built upon volunteerism, and volunteerism is still what it needs today. Finally, all of this, back to the beginning, is what you think cyberspace really is in terms of a historical analogy. And if you pick the wheel, just remember this. The wheel, for about 1,000 years before its invention, was not used for maneuver warfare. It was used for pottery. It took 1,000 years for somebody to figure out, hey, if we tip this thing on a side, we have attached it to an axle, wow, you can actually have chariot warfare, mass migration, the rise of city-states, and basically world history. Everything changed when the wheel changed its utility. My point is, I think cyberspace is changing its utility right now. We won't be able to stop it, but we may be able to steer it in the right direction. Thank you for your time.